He wasn't supposed to bark, not at a dead man. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe no soul should face the dark alone, stay with me, because this story, it doesn't follow the rules. The rain had started just after dawn, a soft English drizzle that clung to coats and quieted footsteps along the narrow stone path leading to St. Bartholomew's Chapel, the kind of rain that never truly falls, only lingers, like a memory that refuses to fade. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and candle wax, the faint trace of polished oak rising from the pews where mourners sat in stillness, hands folded, eyes lowered, each one carrying their own version of loss. At the center of it all stood the coffin, dark and dignified, its surface reflecting the flicker of candlelight in muted gold. A small brass plaque bore the name Arthur Blake, Sergeant, Royal Marines. 34 years old. Too young, they whispered, though no one said it aloud. Silence had a way of enforcing itself in places like this. But silence never lasts. Not when something knows the truth. At the back of the chapel, just beyond the final row of pews, a German shepherd stood rigid against the restraint of a leather lead, his coat damp from the rain, sable fur darkened along his spine, amber eyes locked forward with a focus that did not belong in a place of mourning. His name was Shadow, and he had not moved since the coffin was carried in. Not a step, not a blink, only that stare, fixed and unyielding, as though the world beyond that wooden lid still mattered more than the one surrounding him. The handler beside him, a young corporal with tired eyes, shifted his grip uneasily. "Easy, lad," he murmured under his breath, though the words carried no weight. Shadow's ears twitched once, not at the voice, but at something deeper, something quieter, something no one else seemed to notice. The priest's voice rose gently at the front, measured and calm, echoing softly beneath the chapel's arched ceiling. Words of peace, of rest, of a journey completed. They drifted through the room like smoke, settling on shoulders already burdened by grief. And still, the dog did not move, until he did. It began with a low sound, almost too quiet to register, a vibration deep in his chest that grew slowly, like distant thunder rolling beneath the earth. A growl, restrained but insistent, enough to draw a few glances from the nearest pews. The corporal stiffened. "Shadow," he whispered, firmer now. "Stand down." But Shadow did not stand down. His body tensed, muscles coiling beneath wet fur, paws pressing against the stone floor as though grounding himself against something unseen. The growl sharpened, rising just enough to fracture the fragile stillness of the room. Heads turned. A woman near the aisle frowned, clutching her umbrella a little tighter. Someone coughed, uncertain. The priest paused, just for a moment, before continuing, his voice steady but thinner now, as though even he felt the shift. And then came the bark. Sharp, sudden. It cut through the chapel like a crack of thunder, echoing off the stone walls and shattering what little calm remained. The corporal pulled the lead instinctively. Shadow, no. But the dog surged forward, not in panic, not in fear, but with purpose. One bark became two, then three, each one directed at the coffin, each one louder, more urgent, as if language had failed him, and this was all he had left. The room stirred. Murmurs broke out, low and uneasy. A man in uniform near the front turned sharply, eyes narrowing. Another stepped into the aisle, uncertain whether to intervene. "Take him outside," someone whispered. The corporal nodded, already moving to guide the dog back, but Shadow resisted, paws scraping softly against the stone, his gaze never leaving the coffin. Not for a second, not even when the lead tightened, not even when the room began to close in around him. Because somewhere beneath the polished wood, beneath the silence and ceremony, beneath everything they believed to be final, there was something wrong. And Shadow could feel it. He stopped barking as suddenly as he had begun. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing in from all sides. The dog's head lowered slightly, ears still forward, breath slow, controlled. Then, with a movement so deliberate it seemed almost human, he stepped closer, just one pace, and leaned forward, nose hovering inches from the silence did not hold for long, because silence rarely survives when truth begins to stir beneath it. The corporal's grip tightened again, the leather lead creaking softly as he tried to guide Shadow away, but the dog did not resist with force this time, only with stillness, a refusal rooted so deep it felt less like disobedience and more like conviction. Around them, the murmurs had grown into something heavier, not loud, not chaotic, but threaded with unease, the kind that passes quietly from one person to another without needing words. At the front, the priest lowered his gaze for a brief moment, as though deciding whether to continue or to wait, and in that hesitation, the room seemed to lean inward, drawn by the strange gravity of a single animal standing before a coffin. Daniel Cross stood 2 rows from the aisle, his posture rigid, his hands clasped too tightly in front of him, knuckles pale against the dark fabric of his coat. He had not intended to come forward, had not planned to step out of line or draw attention, but something in the way Shadow had changed, from barking to listening, from noise to focus, stirred a memory that refused to stay buried. He had seen this before, not here, not in a chapel with rain tapping softly against stained glass, but somewhere far hotter, far louder, where the air tasted of dust and metal and decisions had to be made in seconds, not minutes. Back then, Shadow had done the same thing. He had gone still, not confused, not afraid, just certain. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath catching halfway as his eyes returned to the coffin. It looked ordinary enough. Polished wood, brass fittings, a flag folded with care. Everything about it spoke of finality, of a line already drawn. And yet, the dog did not believe in that line. The corporal shifted again, clearly uncomfortable now, glancing toward the front as if seeking silent permission to remove the disturbance, but no one spoke. Not the priest, not the family seated in the first row, not the officers standing along the walls. They simply watched, caught in the quiet pull of something. They did not understand. Shadow lowered his head further, until the tip of his nose nearly touched the wood. His breathing slowed, steady and deliberate, each breath drawn as though measuring something invisible, something just beyond reach. Then he tilted his head slightly, a small adjustment, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Daniel's chest tighten. That was it. That was the sign. Not the barking, not the struggle, but this. The listening. Daniel stepped into the aisle before he realized he had moved. The sound of his shoes against the stone floor echoed softly, each step measured, each one drawing the attention of those nearest to him. A woman turned, her expression uncertain, while a man in uniform frowned slightly, as though weighing whether to intervene. Daniel did not look at them. His eyes remained fixed on the dog, on the way Shadow's entire body seemed aligned with something no one else could feel. "Let him be," Daniel said quietly, his voice low but clear enough to carry. The corporal hesitated. "Sir, I am not sure that is appropriate." "He knows," Daniel replied, almost to himself. The words hung there, fragile and strange, yet impossible to dismiss. The priest stepped back from the lectern, his hands folding loosely, not in surrender, but in recognition that something beyond ceremony was unfolding. The rain outside grew slightly heavier, its soft tapping now more pronounced against the glass, a steady rhythm that filled the spaces between breaths. Shadow did not move, not even when Daniel came to stand beside him. For a moment, the two of them existed in a shared stillness, man and dog, both listening in their own way, both refusing to accept what had already been declared. Daniel crouched slowly, careful not to startle the animal, though Shadow barely acknowledged his presence. "What is it, lad?" he murmured, the question more instinct than expectation. The dog's ears flicked once, then stilled again, his focus unwavering. And then, something shifted. It was not a sound that could be clearly named, not a voice or a knock or anything that would satisfy reason, but rather a faint irregularity in the silence itself, a break so subtle it might have been imagined if not for the way Shadow reacted. His head lifted a fraction, his body tensing just enough to signal change. Daniel felt it too, not in his ears, but somewhere deeper, a quiet awareness that something was not as it should be. He leaned closer, his own breath slowing, his senses narrowing to the space between himself and the coffin. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, though he did not expect an answer. No one responded. No one else had moved. The room remained suspended, held between belief and doubt. The corporal glanced around, clearly unsure, then back at Daniel. "Sir, we cannot just wait," Daniel said, firmer now. The word carried weight this time, enough to still the protest before it could fully form. Shadow shifted his front paw slightly, pressing closer to the coffin, his nose now resting lightly against the wood. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though concentrating, as though reaching for something just beyond the surface. Then he exhaled, a slow, steady breath that seemed to settle the air itself. Daniel's heart began to beat faster, not with panic, but with a rising certainty he could not yet explain. He had trusted this dog before, trusted him with lives, with decisions that could not be undone. And Shadow had never been wrong. Not once. The question was no longer whether the dog was mistaken. The question was whether they were willing to listen. No one moved, because the moment had shifted beyond custom or protocol, beyond the quiet structure of a ceremony meant to end things cleanly, and into something unfinished, something waiting. Daniel remained crouched beside Shadow, his hand hovering just above the dog's shoulder, not touching, not interrupting, as though even the smallest gesture might break whatever fragile connection was forming. The air felt different now, heavier in a way that could not be explained by rain or grief alone, as though the chapel itself had begun to listen. Across the room, a woman in the front pew pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the scene with a mixture of confusion and something closer to hope, though she did not yet dare to name it. The priest stood still, his earlier composure softened into quiet observation, his role momentarily surrendered to something he could not guide. The corporal swallowed, shifting his weight once more, then loosening his grip on the lead without fully letting go. It was not permission, not exactly, but it was no longer resistance. Shadow drew in another slow breath, deeper this time, his chest expanding against the stillness, and for a brief second, his entire body seemed to pause, as though aligning itself with a rhythm hidden beneath the surface. Then his ears lifted again, sharper now, his focus narrowing with renewed intensity. Daniel leaned closer, his own breathing unconsciously matching the dog's cadence, steady, measured, attentive. "What is it you can hear?" he whispered, the words barely more than breath. There was no answer, not in language, but in the shift that followed. Shadow's posture changed, subtle but undeniable. His weight moved forward, not with urgency, but with certainty, and his nose pressed more firmly against the coffin lid, as though closing the final distance between doubt and truth. The room held its breath. Seconds passed, or perhaps longer. Time had begun to lose its usual shape, stretching thin across the silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, there came a sound. Not from the dog, not from the people, from somewhere else. A faint, irregular tap, so soft it might have been mistaken for the settling of wood or the distant echo of rain against stone. But it came again, not louder, only clearer in its pattern, uneven, fragile, but real. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, his head tilting as he listened more carefully, every sense drawn toward that single, impossible detail. "There," he said quietly, though he did not look away from the coffin. "Did you hear that?" No one answered, but the shift in the room was immediate. People leaned forward, not in panic, but in cautious attention, as though drawn by something they could not yet fully perceive. The corporal glanced toward the front again, then back at Daniel, uncertainty written plainly across his face. "It is just the rain," he said, though the words lacked conviction. Shadow exhaled again, slower this time, and then, without warning, he gave a soft, low whine, the kind that carries not fear, but recognition. It was a sound he had made before. Daniel knew it, a sound reserved for moments when something lost was found again, or when something hidden revealed itself at last. Daniel's chest tightened. He had heard that sound on a different day, in a different place, when Shadow had stood before a sealed door, refusing to move until someone opened it. Behind that door, they had found a man still breathing, barely, but alive. The memory settled over him now with quiet certainty. He straightened slowly, rising from his crouch, his movements deliberate, measured, as though stepping into something that could not be undone. "We need to open it," he said. The words did not come loudly, but they carried, cutting cleanly through the fragile quiet. A ripple of reaction moved through the room, not loud, but immediate. A man in uniform near the wall stepped forward. "That is not appropriate," he said, his tone firm, though not unkind. Daniel met his gaze briefly, then returned his attention to the coffin. If I am wrong, he said, we close it again. He paused, just long enough for the weight of what he was suggesting to settle. If I am right, we do not have time. The room seemed to narrow around those words. The priest drew in a slow breath, his eyes shifting from Daniel to the coffin, then to the dog, who had not moved, who had not wavered, whose entire being remained fixed on that single point. The woman in the front pew lowered her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as they rested against her lap. Please, she said softly, her voice fragile but clear. It was not an order. It was not even a request made with certainty. It was something else. A permission born from the smallest seed of belief. The man in uniform hesitated, then glanced toward the priest. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the priest gave the slightest nod. Not an instruction, not a command. Simply an acknowledgement that something beyond understanding was asking to be heard. Daniel stepped forward. The distance between him and the coffin was no more than a few feet, yet it felt longer, as though each step carried him further from what was known and closer to something uncertain. Shadow shifted with him, staying close, his presence steady, unwavering. Daniel reached the side of the coffin and placed his hand gently against the polished wood. It was cool to the touch, smooth, unyielding. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to feel the weight of the moment, then looked once more at the dog. Shadow's eyes met his. No fear, no confusion, only certainty. Daniel nodded, almost imperceptibly, and turned to the for a moment. No one stepped forward, because the line between respect and doubt had always been clear, and now it had been crossed in a single quiet sentence. Daniel's hand remained on the coffin, steady but patient, as though he understood that this was not something that could be rushed, not by force, not by rank, but only by belief. The man in uniform hesitated beside him, his jaw tightening slightly as he weighed what was being asked, the weight of protocol pressing against something more human, more uncertain. Across the chapel, the rain continued its soft rhythm against the stained glass, a steady pulse that seemed to echo the fragile pattern they had begun to notice. Shadow stood close, his body aligned with Daniel's, his gaze never leaving the coffin, not for a second, not even as the room shifted around them. He did not bark again. He did not need to. The certainty in him had already been spoken. The priest stepped down from the front slowly, his shoes making a faint sound against the stone floor, his expression calm but changed, no longer guiding, but witnessing. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes resting briefly on the dog, then on Daniel, and finally on the coffin itself. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet acceptance that something beyond understanding had entered the room. If there is doubt, he said softly, then we must not ignore it. The words settled gently, yet they carried enough weight to tip the balance. The man in uniform exhaled slowly, then gave a small nod, not fully convinced, but no longer resisting. Another stepped forward to assist, his movements careful, deliberate, as though approaching something fragile rather than fixed. Together, they positioned themselves at either side of the coffin, hands hovering just above the polished surface, pausing once more as if listening for any reason to stop. The room had grown so still that even the faintest sound felt magnified. Somewhere near the back, a chair creaked softly as someone shifted, but no one spoke. No one dared to break what had formed. Daniel glanced once more at Shadow. The dog's ears were forward, his posture unchanged, his breath slow and measured, as though anchored to something deeper than instinct. Daniel gave the smallest nod, then placed both hands firmly against the edge of the lid. On three, he said quietly. The others mirrored his position, their fingers finding grip along the smooth wood. No one counted aloud at first. The number seemed unnecessary. Instead, there was a shared inhale, a moment where time seemed to gather itself, and then, together, they began to lift. The lid did not move easily. It had been sealed with care, with intention, and for a brief second, resistance held, as though the world itself questioned what they were doing. Then it gave, just enough to shift, just enough to break the seal that had defined the moment until now. A faint sound escaped as the lid lifted, not loud, but distinct, the gentle release of something closed too soon. They raised it slowly, carefully, each movement measured, each inch revealing more of what lay beneath, yet no one leaned in, no one rushed forward. The tension was not in what they would see, but in what they might feel. Shadow stepped closer, just one pace, his nose lifting slightly, his eyes fixed on the opening with unwavering focus. Daniel's breath caught, not from fear, but from the quiet weight of possibility pressing in from all sides. The lid rose further, the interior of the coffin beginning to show, shadows giving way to form, to shape, to the outline of a man they had all come to say goodbye to. Arthur Blake lay still, his uniform pressed neatly, his face calm, untouched by the noise that had surrounded him moments before. For a second, nothing changed. No movement, no sign, just the stillness they had expected, the stillness they had been told to accept. A few in the room exhaled softly, the tension releasing just enough to suggest that perhaps this had been a mistake, that perhaps grief had simply taken an unexpected form. But Shadow did not move. He did not step back. He did not lower his gaze. Instead, he leaned forward, closer now, until his nose hovered just above Arthur's chest. And then he stilled again, listening, not with his ears, but with something deeper, something that did not rely on certainty or proof. Seconds passed, long enough for doubt to return, long enough for the room to begin closing itself back around the familiar shape of loss. Then, faintly, so faintly that it might have been missed by anyone not waiting for it, there came a shift. Not in the room, not in the people, in the man. It was not a movement at first, not something the eye could catch easily, but rather a subtle rise, a barely perceptible change beneath the fabric of his uniform, as though something within him had remembered how to begin again. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes narrowing, his breath held tight in his chest. "Wait," he whispered, though no one had moved. The others froze, their hands still holding the lifted lid, suspended between closing and opening, between certainty and something else entirely. Shadow let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and lowered his head gently, resting it against Arthur's chest with a care that spoke of recognition rather than desperation. And in that contact, the silence broke, not with for a moment, no one breathed, because the word itself had not yet been spoken, and yet every soul in the chapel felt it at the same time, that fragile, impossible truth rising beneath the surface of what had already been accepted. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the faint movement beneath the fabric, not trusting it, not daring to believe it fully, and yet unable to look away. "There is a pulse," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried, threading through the silence like a spark in dry air. The reaction was not immediate, not loud, but it spread, a ripple through still water, subtle and unstoppable. The corporal stepped forward. Instinctively, his earlier uncertainty replaced by something sharper, more urgent. "Are you certain?" he asked, though his tone had already shifted from doubt to readiness. Daniel did not answer at once. He did not need to. Shadow remained where he was, his head resting gently against Arthur's chest, his body perfectly still except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing, which now seemed to match the faint rhythm beneath him. The dog's ears softened slightly, no longer rigid, no longer searching, as though the answer he had been holding on to had finally been heard by others. The priest took a step closer, his composure steady, but his eyes reflecting a quiet astonishment he did not attempt to hide. "We need a medic," someone said from the back, the words breaking through the moment with a sudden clarity that shifted everything into motion. The chapel, which had been frozen in uncertainty, began to move, not chaotically, but with purpose, as though each person understood their role without needing instruction. A man in uniform reached for his radio, his voice controlled but urgent as he called for immediate assistance, his words precise, careful, grounded in training that now met something beyond expectation. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, indifferent to the shift inside. Yet somehow it felt different now, no longer a backdrop to mourning, but a quiet witness to something beginning again. Daniel placed his hand gently on Arthur's shoulder, not shaking him, not forcing anything, only grounding himself in the reality of what he was seeing. The rise of the chest came again, faint but unmistakable, followed by a pause, then another, each one uneven, fragile, but present. "Stay with us," Daniel murmured, the words spoken more from instinct than thought, as though the man before him could hear beyond the silence that held him. Shadow lifted his head slightly, just enough to look at Daniel, his amber eyes calm now, no longer urgent, no longer pleading. The shift in him was subtle but profound. The work, in his mind, had been done. He had found what needed to be found. Now he simply remained, close, steady, a quiet anchor in the center of a moment that refused to follow any known pattern. The corporal moved closer, kneeling beside the coffin, his hands hovering uncertainly before settling gently near Arthur's wrist, careful, respectful, searching for the same truth. His breath caught as he felt it, faint beneath his fingertips. "It is there," he said, louder now, unable to keep the note of disbelief from his voice. The confirmation changed everything. What had been doubt became urgency. What had been stillness became action. And yet beneath it all, there remained a strange calm, as though the room understood that this was not chaos, but something far more deliberate. The medic arrived quickly, his boots echoing softly against the stone floor as he crossed the threshold, his eyes scanning the scene with trained efficiency before focusing on the man in the coffin. He did not question how or why. There would be time for that later. Now there was only the task in front of him. He set down his kit with care, his movements precise, controlled, his presence grounding the room in something familiar, something practical. "Give me space," he said, not sharply, but firmly enough to clear the immediate area. Daniel stepped back slightly, though his gaze never left Arthur. Shadow moved only enough to allow access, his body shifting to the side, but remaining close, his presence constant. The medic leaned in, listening, watching, his hands steady as he assessed the faint signs of life that had been missed. "He is with us," he said after a moment, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a weight that settled into every corner of the chapel. "Not gone, not finished. With us." The words lingered, reshaping the space around them, turning what had been an ending into something unfinished, something open. The woman in the front pew let out a quiet breath she had been holding, her shoulders trembling slightly as her hand rose once more to her face, not to hide grief now, but something else, something lighter, though just as overwhelming. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in disbelief, but in quiet recognition, as though a truth he had almost forgotten had returned to him in the most unexpected way. When he opened them again, he looked at Shadow. The dog had settled beside the coffin, his body relaxed now, his gaze soft, his ears no longer straining. He did not seek praise. He did not look for approval. He simply remained, close to the man he had refused to leave behind. And in that stillness, the room began to understand that what they had witnessed was not defiance, not disruption, but something far simpler and far deeper. Loyalty that did not recognize endings. Loyalty that listened when the world had already decided to stop. The shift from stillness to motion did not arrive with noise, but with intention, each movement inside the chapel guided by something steady and deliberate, as though the moment itself demanded care rather than haste. The medic worked with quiet focus, his hands moving with practiced precision as he adjusted Arthur's position slightly, ensuring his airway remained clear, his attention anchored entirely on the fragile rhythm that had returned against all expectation. The faint rise of Arthur's chest continued, uneven but persistent, each breath a small defiance against the certainty that had been placed upon him only moments before. Daniel stepped back another pace, giving space, yet unable to remove himself fully, his eyes fixed on the man he had already begun to mourn, now caught between two realities that refused to reconcile. The rain outside softened, its steady tapping easing into a lighter rhythm, as though the world itself had shifted its tone in response to what had unfolded within the stone walls. Shadow remained beside the coffin, his body relaxed now, no longer driven by urgency, but by presence, his amber eyes half-lidded as he watched the subtle movements of the man he had never abandoned. There was no excitement in him, no restless energy, only a quiet certainty that had settled into something deeper, something calmer, as though the question that had driven him had finally been answered. The corporal exhaled slowly, running a hand through his damp hair, his earlier tension giving way to a quiet disbelief that he did not attempt to hide. "I have never seen anything like it," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Daniel heard the words but did not respond. His focus remained on Arthur, on the faint color beginning to return to his face, on the small but undeniable signs that life had not left, only withdrawn. waiting for something to call it back. The medic glanced up briefly, his expression composed, yet carrying a subtle urgency that spoke of time regained, not time to waste. "We need to get him to hospital," he said, his voice calm but firm, grounding the moment in action once more. "He is stable enough to move, but not for long without proper support." The statement carried weight, not as a warning, but as a clear path forward. The room responded accordingly. Another man in uniform moved quickly to assist, retrieving a stretcher from just outside the chapel, his footsteps brisk but controlled, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that still lingered. The priest stepped aside, offering space without hesitation, his role now transformed from guiding an ending to witnessing a continuation. As the stretcher was brought in, its presence shifted the atmosphere again, not back to grief, but towards something more purposeful, more grounded. The finality that had once filled the room had been replaced by a quiet urgency, each person now part of something that required attention rather than acceptance. Daniel approached slowly, his steps measured, until he stood once more beside the coffin. He looked down at Arthur, taking in the details he had already memorized once before, now seeing them differently, not as a farewell, but as a beginning still unfolding. "You chose a strange way to come back," he said softly, the words carrying a faint trace of warmth beneath their quiet delivery. There was no response, not yet, but the steady rise of Arthur's chest continued, enough to answer in its own way. Shadow lifted his head slightly, his gaze moving from Arthur to Daniel, then back again, as though acknowledging the shared understanding between them. The bond between man and dog did not need explanation. It existed in the spaces between words, in the quiet decisions made without hesitation. As the medic and his assistant carefully prepared to move Arthur, their hands steady, their movements coordinated, Shadow stepped back just enough to allow them space, but remained close, his presence unwavering. He did not interfere. He did not question. He simply stayed. The transfer was done with care, each motion deliberate, each adjustment mindful of the fragile state Arthur remained in. The stretcher settled, and for a brief moment, the chapel fell into a quieter stillness once more, not the heavy silence of mourning, but something lighter, something suspended between relief and disbelief. The woman in the front pew stood slowly, her movements tentative, as though unsure whether she was allowed to approach. When she did, her steps were small, careful, her eyes fixed on Arthur with a mixture of hope and hesitation. She did not speak. She did not reach out. She simply stood, close enough to see, to believe, to witness what had been returned. The medic nodded once, signaling readiness, and the men began to move, guiding the stretcher toward the chapel doors. The sound of wheels against stone echoed softly, steady and purposeful, marking the transition from one space to another. Daniel followed a step behind, his gaze shifting briefly to Shadow. "Come on, lad," he said quietly. Shadow rose without hesitation, falling into step beside him, his movements smooth, his posture calm. Together, they moved toward the doorway, toward the gray light of the morning that waited beyond the chapel walls. As the doors opened, the cool air carried the scent of rain and earth, fresh and grounding, a contrast to the stillness they left behind. The world outside had not changed. The sky remained overcast, the path still damp beneath careful footsteps, but something within it felt different, as though the ordinary had made space for something quietly extraordinary. The stretcher was guided carefully toward the waiting vehicle, the medic continuing his steady work, his focus unwavering. Daniel paused for a brief moment at the threshold, turning back once more to look inside the chapel. The candles still burned. The pews remained filled, the space unchanged, and yet entirely different. He exhaled slowly, then stepped forward, following the others into the rain. Shadow remained at his side, close, silent, his presence a quiet reminder that some truths do not need to be explained, only followed, even when they lead beyond what the world considers possible. The vehicle doors closed with a muted thud, sealing in a space that felt both urgent and strangely calm, as though the world outside had been left to its own quiet rhythm, while something more fragile unfolded within. The engine started, a low hum beneath the steady patter of rain on the roof, and the ambulance pulled away from the chapel, its movement smooth, deliberate, carrying Arthur through narrow village roads lined with stone walls darkened by the damp. Inside, the medic worked with focused precision, his hands steady as he monitored each breath. Each faint signal that confirmed the life they had nearly lost was still holding on. The rise and fall of Arthur's chest remained uneven, fragile, yet present, each breath a small act of defiance against the silence that had once surrounded him. Daniel sat opposite, his posture still, his gaze fixed, as though any shift in attention might somehow break the delicate thread that connected them all to this moment. Shadow lay at his feet, close enough that his flank brushed lightly against Daniel's boot, his breathing slow, measured, in quiet harmony with the faint rhythm coming from the stretcher. There was no restlessness in him, no lingering urgency, only presence, the kind that stays when the work is done, not because it must, but because it chooses to. The road curved gently, tires rolling over wet gravel for a brief stretch before returning to tarmac, the subtle changes in sound marking their progress through a landscape that remained indifferent to the extraordinary moment it now carried. Fields stretched beyond the windows, softened by mist, hedgerows blurred by the rain, everything familiar, everything unchanged. And yet, inside that moving space, nothing felt ordinary. The medic glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting Daniel's for a fraction of a second. "He is holding," he said quietly, the words measured, grounded, yet carrying a quiet reassurance that settled into the air. Daniel nodded once, the movement small, controlled, as though even relief had to be handled with care. "He always did," Daniel replied, his voice low, the faintest trace of something softer beneath the restraint. Shadow's ear flicked at the sound, a subtle acknowledgement, before settling again, his gaze lifting briefly toward Arthur, then returning to stillness. The bond between them did not require noise. It did not need explanation. It simply remained, steady as breath, present as time itself. The journey continued in silence, broken only by the quiet sounds of movement, of equipment, of life being measured and supported. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer. Time had taken on a different quality, stretching and folding in ways that no longer followed the clock. At one point, Arthur's fingers shifted, barely perceptible, a slight movement beneath the blanket, as though something within him was beginning to reach outward again. The medic noticed it first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the change. "That is a good sign," he said, more to himself than to the others, yet the words carried, settling into Daniel's awareness with quiet weight. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening, his breath held just a fraction longer as he watched. The movement did not repeat immediately, but its presence had already altered the space, adding another layer to the fragile certainty they were beginning to build. Shadow lifted his head then, not abruptly, but with a slow, deliberate motion, his gaze fixing on Arthur's hand for a moment before shifting upward toward his face. His ears moved forward, attentive once more, though without the urgency that had defined him earlier. It was different now, not searching, not questioning, simply aware. The vehicle slowed as it approached the hospital, the change in speed marked by the gentle shift of weight, the hum of the engine lowering slightly as they turned into the entrance. The building rose ahead, clean lines softened by rain, windows reflecting the gray sky in muted tones. The doors opened quickly upon arrival, staff already waiting, their movements efficient, coordinated, prepared for what had been communicated ahead. The stretcher was guided out with care, wheels meeting the wet ground before transitioning smoothly onto the covered entrance, the sound shifting from soft gravel to firm concrete. Daniel stepped out after them, the cool air brushing against his face, grounding him once more in the reality of where they were. Shadow followed without hesitation, staying close, his presence as constant as the breath they had fought to preserve. Inside, the hospital corridors carried a different kind of silence, one shaped by routine, by expectation, by the steady rhythm of care and recovery. The team moved quickly, guiding Arthur through the doors, their focus unwavering, their actions precise. Daniel paused just inside, watching as the stretcher disappeared down the corridor, the distance between them growing with each step, yet the connection remaining, unseen but unbroken. Shadow sat beside him, his posture calm, his gaze steady, not fixed on the doors, but on Daniel himself for a brief moment, as though confirming something unspoken. Daniel looked down at him, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "You knew," he said quietly, the words carrying no question, only recognition. Shadow blinked once, slowly, then turned his head toward the corridor again, his attention returning to the place where Arthur had been taken. The rain continued outside, unseen now, its steady rhythm replaced by the softer sounds of footsteps, distant voices, the quiet hum of a building that never truly slept. And within that space, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not be forgotten. A moment where certainty had been questioned, where silence had been listened to, and where a life had answered back, not with words, but with the simplest, most powerful rhythm of all. Time inside the hospital did not move the same way it did outside, because here it was measured not in minutes or hours, but in breaths, in signals, in the quiet rise and fall of something that refused to fade. Daniel remained in the corridor, standing just far enough from the doors to avoid being in the way, yet close enough to feel connected to whatever was happening beyond them. The white walls carried a faint scent of antiseptic, clean and controlled, a contrast to the damp earth and candle wax of the chapel they had left behind. Footsteps passed occasionally, soft and purposeful, nurses moving between rooms, voices low, everything guided by routine. And yet, for Daniel, none of it felt routine. Not anymore. Shadow sat beside him, his posture composed, his body relaxed in a way that suggested certainty had settled into something deeper. He did not pace. He did not whine. He simply watched the doors, his gaze steady, as though he understood that waiting was now part of the work. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer. The clock on the wall marked each second with quiet precision, but Daniel did not look at it. He measured time differently now, in the memory of that first faint heartbeat, in the image of Arthur's chest rising when it should not have. A nurse approached briefly, her expression professional yet softened by curiosity, her eyes flicking toward the dog before returning to Daniel. "You will need to wait here," she said gently. Daniel nodded once, the movement minimal, respectful. "We are not going anywhere," he replied, his voice calm, grounded. The nurse offered a small, understanding smile before continuing down the corridor, her steps fading into the distance. Shadow shifted slightly, adjusting his position, his body settling closer to Daniel's leg, a quiet reassurance that needed no words. The bond between them had been forged in moments that did not ask permission, and this was no different. Somewhere beyond the doors, equipment moved, voices exchanged information, decisions were made. Daniel could not see it, but he could feel it, the steady rhythm of action, of care, of life being held and guided back from a place it had almost crossed. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension that had carried him from the chapel beginning to ease, though not fully. Not yet, because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something uncertain, something fragile, something that required patience. Shadow lifted his head slightly, his ears tilting as though catching a sound too distant for human hearing. His gaze sharpened for a moment, then softened. Again, his body remaining still. Daniel noticed the change, subtle as it was, and glanced down at him. "What is it?" he murmured, though he did not expect an answer. Shadow did not move. He simply listened, the same way he had in the chapel, though now there was no urgency, only awareness. The doors at the end of the corridor opened quietly, and a doctor stepped out, his posture composed, his expression measured. He paused for a moment, scanning the corridor before his eyes settled on Daniel and the dog beside him. There was a brief hesitation, as though he was deciding how to begin. Then he walked toward them with calm, deliberate steps. Daniel straightened slightly, his attention sharpening, his breath steady but held just beneath the surface. The doctor stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting briefly to Shadow before returning to Daniel. "He is responding," he said, his voice clear, professional, yet carrying a quiet note of something more. "It is early, but there are signs of neurological activity improving. His body is beginning to stabilize." The words settled into the space between them, not as a resolution, but as a continuation. Daniel nodded once, absorbing the information, grounding it in the reality he had already begun to accept. "Will he wake?" he asked, the question simple, direct. The doctor paused, considering his answer carefully. It is possible, he said, but it will take time. What matters is that he did not stop completely. That is unusual, given the circumstances. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The meaning was clear enough. Daniel glanced down at Shadow, his hand moving almost instinctively to rest lightly against the dog's neck, fingers brushing through damp fur that had not yet fully dried from the rain. He did not stop, Daniel said quietly, his gaze returning to the doctor. The statement was not an explanation. It was a fact. The doctor followed his gaze for a moment, studying the dog with a thoughtful expression, then gave a small nod, as though acknowledging something he could not quantify. Sometimes, he said, there are things we cannot measure. The words lingered, not as a conclusion, but as an acceptance of something beyond the charts and monitors behind those doors. Shadow leaned slightly into Daniel's touch, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. He did not react to the conversation. He did not seek recognition. He simply remained, as he always had, close to the man who had needed him. The corridor returned to its quiet rhythm, the doctor moving on, the doors closing once more, the sounds beyond them continuing unseen. Daniel remained where he was, not restless, not impatient, but present. The waiting no longer felt empty. It felt purposeful, because somewhere beyond that door, a man who had been declared gone was now being called back, one breath at a time. And beside him, a dog who had refused the corridor settled into a quieter rhythm as the hours stretched forward, the early morning light slowly shifting through the tall windows at the far end, turning from a muted gray into something softer, something that hinted at warmth even if it had not yet fully arrived. Daniel had not moved far from where he first stood, only adjusting his posture now and then, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, as though his body understood the need to remain ready, even when there was nothing to do. Shadow remained beside him, his presence unchanged, a steady anchor in a space defined by waiting. Every so often, the dog would lift his head slightly, ears tilting toward the distant sounds behind the doors, then settle again, as though confirming something only he could sense. The hospital continued around them, staff passing by with quiet efficiency, conversations kept low, footsteps measured, everything moving with the calm urgency that belonged to a place where life was constantly balanced on the edge of uncertainty. Yet for Daniel, all of it existed at a distance. His attention remained fixed on the unseen, on the man behind those doors, on the fragile line that had been pulled back from its end. At one point, a faint sound came from within the room, something indistinct, a shift perhaps, or a movement of equipment, but it was enough to draw Shadow's attention immediately. The dog's head lifted, his posture sharpening just a fraction, his gaze locking onto the closed doors with renewed focus. Daniel noticed the change at once, his own awareness tightening as he followed the direction of Shadow's attention. Something changed, he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Shadow did not respond with sound. He did not need to. The subtle tension in his body was enough. Moments later, the door opened again, not with urgency, but with purpose. The same doctor stepped out, his expression slightly different this time, less measured, more open, as though the outcome he carried was beginning to take shape. Daniel straightened, his breath steady but held beneath the surface, his gaze fixed on the man approaching him. The doctor stopped a short distance away, his eyes moving briefly to Shadow before returning to Daniel. "He is beginning to come around," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet note of certainty that had not been there before. "It is not full consciousness yet, but there are clear signs. Reflexes are returning. There is response to stimulus." The words settled gently, not explosive, not overwhelming, but deeply significant. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his shoulders easing just slightly as the meaning of those words took hold. "Will he know where he is?" Daniel asked quietly. The doctor considered for a moment before answering. "It may take time for full awareness to return," he said. "But the important part is that he is coming back. His body is finding its way again." Shadow shifted then, rising smoothly to his feet, his posture alert but calm, his gaze moving from the doctor to the door and back again, as though aligning himself with what was unfolding beyond sight. Daniel glanced down at him, a faint trace of something softer crossing his expression. "You hear it before we do," he said quietly. The dog's ears flicked once, then settled, his focus unwavering. The doctor observed this exchange briefly, then gave a small nod, as though acknowledging something he would not attempt to explain. "We will move him to a monitored ward shortly," he said. "You may be able to see him then, but only briefly. He will need rest." Daniel nodded, the movement controlled. "Respectful." "That is enough," he replied. The doctor gave a final glance toward Shadow, then turned and walked back through the door, leaving it to close softly behind him. The corridor returned to its quiet state, but something within it had shifted again. The waiting was no longer uncertain. It had direction now, a clear path forward, however slow it might be. Shadow remained standing, his body angled toward the door, his attention fixed, as though he understood that the distance between them and Arthur was beginning to close. Minutes passed, then more. Time stretched again, but it no longer felt empty. It carried purpose, each second bringing them closer to something that had nearly been lost. Finally, the door opened once more, and a nurse stepped out, her expression gentle, her voice low as she addressed Daniel. "You may come in now," she said. Daniel hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, his movements measured, his breath steadying as he crossed the threshold. Shadow moved with him, silent and close, his presence unwavering as always. Inside, the room was quiet, the light softer, filtered through drawn curtains, the air filled with the faint hum of monitored equipment. Arthur lay on the bed, his form still, yet undeniably different from before. There was life in the small movements now, in the subtle shifts that had not been there in the chapel. His chest rose and fell with a steadier rhythm, his skin carrying a hint of color that spoke of something returning. Daniel approached slowly, stopping at the side of the bed, his eyes taking in every detail, grounding himself in the reality before him. Shadow moved closer as well, his steps careful, his head lowering slightly as he came within reach of Arthur's hand. For a moment, nothing happened. The room held its breath again, not in fear, but in anticipation. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Arthur's fingers moved. A small motion, fragile, uncertain, but real. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet, steady. "You are not done yet," he said. Shadow remained still, his gaze fixed on Arthur's hand, his presence calm, as though he had known all along that this moment would come, that the silence had never been the end, only a pause waiting to be broken. The movement of Arthur's fingers did not stop after that first fragile attempt. It lingered, uncertain, as though his body was remembering something it had nearly forgotten, something as simple and as complex as being present. Daniel did not speak again immediately, because there are moments when words only risk breaking what is quietly returning, and this was one of them. He remained where he was, his posture steady, his gaze fixed, allowing the silence to hold its shape without interruption. The soft hum of the monitors filled the space, each gentle tone marking the rhythm that had once been lost and now carried forward with cautious persistence. Shadow stood beside the bed, his head lowered slightly, his amber eyes fixed on Arthur's hand with unwavering attention, as though every small movement mattered, as though each one confirmed what he had known all along. The room itself felt smaller now, not in size, but in focus, as though everything within it had narrowed to the space between breath and awareness, between stillness and return. Arthur's fingers moved again, slightly more defined this time, a faint curl, then a pause, as though testing the connection between intention and motion. His breathing remained steady, more even than before, no longer fragile in the same way, but still cautious, still finding its rhythm. A nurse standing near the doorway observed quietly, her presence unobtrusive, her eyes attentive as she noted each change without interrupting the delicate progression. Daniel took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling in measured control, grounding himself in what he was witnessing. "That is it," he said softly, not as an instruction, but as recognition. The words did not demand anything. They simply acknowledged what was already happening. Shadow shifted his weight slightly, stepping closer by a fraction, his nose hovering near Arthur's hand without touching, as though careful not to disturb the moment, yet unwilling to be distant from it. His ears remained forward, attentive, his entire posture aligned with the quiet unfolding before him. Time moved. Differently again, slower now, each second carrying weight, each small change expanding into something meaningful. Arthur's eyelids flickered faintly, not fully opening, but enough to signal that something deeper was beginning to stir, something beyond reflex, something closer to awareness. Daniel leaned forward just slightly, careful not to intrude, his voice low, steady. "You are safe," he said, the words simple, grounded, offering nothing more than presence. There was no immediate response, not in the way one might expect, but the subtle shift in Arthur's breathing suggested that something within him registered the sound, however faintly. Shadow's head lifted a fraction, his gaze moving from the hand to Arthur's face, his posture sharpening once more, though without urgency, only awareness. The nurse stepped forward then, her movements gentle, professional, adjusting a monitor with quiet efficiency before stepping back again, her role supportive, not dominant. The room remained calm, undisturbed, as though everyone within it understood that this was not a moment to be rushed. Arthur's fingers moved once more, this time with slightly more strength, curling inward before relaxing again, the motion small but unmistakable. Daniel's eyes softened slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to allow something else to settle in its place, something quieter, something closer to relief, though still held carefully, as though it might shift if acknowledged too quickly. "He is coming back," Daniel murmured, the words barely above a whisper. Shadow did not react outwardly, but there was a subtle change in him, a softening, a release of the last trace of tension that had held him since the chapel. His work, if it could be called that, had never been about proving anything. It had been about staying, about refusing to leave when something unseen still remained. And now, as Arthur's body continued its slow return, that purpose had fulfilled itself without need for recognition. The faint flicker of Arthur's eyelids came again, slightly more pronounced, though still not fully open, his awareness hovering at the edge, not yet crossing fully into wakefulness. His breathing deepened just a fraction, each inhale steadier, each exhale more controlled, as though his body was aligning itself with the world once more. Daniel remained still, allowing the moment to unfold without pressure, without expectation beyond what was already present. The quiet hum of the room continued, steady and reassuring, the outside world held at a distance by walls that now contained something fragile and profound. Shadow lowered himself gently to the floor beside the bed, his body settling into a relaxed position, his head resting lightly near Arthur's arm, close enough to remain connected, yet not intrusive. His eyes remained open, calm, watchful, his presence constant. Minutes passed in this quiet state, each one carrying subtle changes, small movements, slight shifts that collectively formed the beginning of something greater. Arthur's hand moved once more, this time drifting slightly toward the edge of the bed, closer to where Shadow rested. The movement was slow, uncoordinated, but intentional enough to be noticed. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm, still grounded. "You are not alone," he said. Shadow did not move immediately, but as Arthur's fingers came within reach, he lifted his head just enough to meet them, allowing the faintest contact, a gentle brush of fur against skin. It was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it carried something beyond its simplicity. Arthur's fingers paused there, resting lightly against Shadow's fur, the connection fragile but real. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again, not in tension, but in quiet recognition. Not everything needed to be understood. Some things only needed to be witnessed. And as Arthur's breathing continued, steady and present, and Shadow remained at his side, unmoving, it became clear that what had been nearly lost had not been reclaimed by force or by chance, but by something far quieter, something that had refused to accept an ending before its time. The contact between Arthur's fingers and Shadow's fur did not break immediately. It lingered, fragile yet deliberate, as though the connection itself carried something that reached beyond sensation into recognition. Arthur's hand remained there, resting lightly, the movement no longer accidental, no longer drifting, but holding, however faintly. Daniel watched without speaking, his breath steady, his presence anchored in the quiet understanding that this moment did not need guidance, only space. The soft hum of the monitors continued, unchanged, yet each tone now felt fuller, more certain, as though the rhythm behind them had found its footing. Arthur's eyelids shifted again, this time with more intent, the faint flicker deepening into something that suggested effort, awareness pressing gently against the surface. It was not sudden. It did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like light filtering through early morning cloud, hesitant at first, then gradually more defined. Shadow remained still, his body relaxed but attentive, his head positioned close enough to feel the subtle changes in Arthur's breathing, in the slight tension of his muscles, in the quiet signals that passed between them without sound. Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice calm, steady, carrying no urgency, only presence. "You are back with us," he said, the words simple, grounded, offering nothing more than truth. Arthur's fingers tightened just slightly against Shadow's fur, not fully closing, not strong, but enough to show intention, enough to confirm that something within him was responding. The nurse at the doorway took a step closer, her eyes attentive, her expression composed yet softened by the significance of what she was witnessing. She adjusted a monitor quietly, her movements careful, then stepped back again, allowing the moment to remain undisturbed. Arthur's breathing deepened a fraction more, each inhale fuller, each exhale steadier, as though his body was remembering its rhythm piece by piece. His eyelids lifted again, this time not just flickering, but opening a fraction, revealing a glimpse of unfocused gaze beneath, a narrow window into awareness that had not yet fully formed. Daniel did not move closer. He did not reach out. He remained where he was, allowing Arthur the space to find his way back without pressure, without expectation beyond what was already unfolding. "Take your time," Daniel said quietly, the words barely above a whisper, yet clear enough to carry meaning. Shadow shifted slightly then, not away, but closer, his head lifting just enough to meet Arthur's hand again as it moved faintly, the contact re-established with gentle precision. There was no urgency in the motion. It was patient, deliberate, as though both understood that this connection did not need to be forced. Arthur's eyes opened a little more, still unfocused, still searching, but present, undeniably present. The room held its quiet shape, the outside world distant, irrelevant, as everything narrowed to the slow return of awareness. A faint crease formed between Arthur's brows, subtle, almost imperceptible, as though his mind was reaching through layers of silence, attempting to piece together where he was, what had happened, why the world felt both familiar and distant at once. Daniel watched carefully, his expression steady, offering nothing that might overwhelm, only the quiet reassurance of being there. "You are safe," he repeated, the words consistent, grounding. Shadow's ears flicked once, then settled, his gaze fixed on Arthur's face, his presence unwavering. The bond between them did not require explanation. It existed in the way Arthur's fingers remained against his fur, in the way Shadow did not move away, in the quiet alignment of their stillness. Arthur's lips parted slightly, not forming words, not yet, but enough to suggest the beginning of something more, something that would take time to fully return. The nurse stepped forward again, her voice soft, careful not to disturb the delicate balance. "He is responding well," she said quietly, more to Daniel than to Arthur, though her tone carried reassurance for both. Daniel nodded once, his attention never leaving Arthur, his focus grounded in the small, steady signs that continued to build. "He always finds his way," Daniel replied, the words carrying quiet certainty rather than hope. Shadow lowered himself gently once more, settling beside the bed, his head resting near Arthur's arm, close enough to remain connected, yet still, respectful of the fragile state of recovery. His eyes remained open, calm, watchful, as though he understood that the journey was not complete, only begun. Arthur's gaze shifted slightly, still unfocused, but moving, searching, his awareness expanding in small increments. The crease in his brow softened just a fraction, his breathing remaining steady, his body no longer suspended between states, but gradually returning to one. Daniel allowed himself a slow breath, the tension that had carried him from the chapel easing further, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. Not relief, not fully, something deeper. Recognition. The room remained calm, unchanged in its structure, yet entirely different in its meaning. What had once been a place of uncertainty had become a space of quiet return, where each breath, each movement, Each subtle sign carried weight beyond its size. Arthur's fingers moved once more, not drifting this time, but resting with intention against Shadow's fur, the connection steady, real. And in that stillness, it became clear that what had begun in silence had not ended there. It had simply waited, held in place by something that refused to let go, until the moment came for it to begin again. The room no longer felt like a place where something had been lost. It had become a place where something was being carefully rebuilt, breath by breath, moment by moment, without urgency, without force. Arthur's eyes remained partially open now, no longer flickering in and out, but holding, however faintly, to the world around him. The focus was not yet clear, his gaze still searching, still adjusting to light, to form, to presence, but it was there, undeniably present, anchored in the quiet space between awareness and memory. Daniel stood beside the bed, his posture steady, his presence unchanged, offering nothing more than constancy. He did not speak immediately, because there are moments when silence allows more to return than words ever could. Shadow remained at Arthur's side, his body settled against the floor, his head resting near the edge of the bed, close enough that the connection between them never broke. His breathing was slow, calm, aligned with the rhythm that had once nearly faded. Arthur's fingers still rested in his fur, no longer drifting, no longer uncertain, but holding with a faint, steady intention. It was not strength, not yet, but it was choice. Arthur's gaze shifted slightly, his eyes moving across the room, not fully recognizing, not yet understanding, but searching, as though trying to gather pieces of something scattered. His brow creased faintly again, a sign not of pain, but of effort, of a mind beginning to work through the quiet fog that had held it. Daniel leaned forward just enough to enter that narrow field of vision, careful, measured, ensuring that his presence was not overwhelming, only grounding. "You are in hospital," he said softly, the words simple, clear, offered without pressure. Arthur's eyes paused on him, not fully focused, but lingering longer than before, as though something familiar had surfaced beneath the uncertainty. His lips parted slightly, the movement small, uncertain, but deliberate, as though he was reaching for something that had not yet returned to him fully. No sound came, but the intention was there, and that was enough. Shadow lifted his head then, his ears tilting forward, his gaze moving to Arthur's face, attentive, present, as though he understood that this moment carried a different kind of significance. The urgency was gone. What remained was something quieter, something deeper. Arthur's fingers tightened again, just a fraction more, enough for Shadow to feel it, enough for Daniel to see it. The connection held. The nurse stepped closer once more, her movements careful, her voice low. "He is stabilizing well," she said, her tone calm, steady, offering reassurance without breaking the quiet atmosphere that had formed. Daniel nodded, acknowledging without shifting his focus. Arthur's breathing continued, steady now, no longer uneven, no longer fragile in the same way, but grounded, supported, present. His eyes moved again, slowly, taking in more of the room, the soft light filtering through the curtains, the shapes and forms that were beginning to settle into something recognizable. The confusion had not gone, but it was changing, softening, giving way to something more stable. Daniel remained still, his voice returning only when it felt necessary, when it could support rather than disrupt. "You are safe," he repeated quietly, the consistency of the words forming a steady anchor in the space between them. Arthur's gaze returned to him briefly, lingering again, the recognition not complete, but forming, like a memory just out of reach. His hand shifted slightly, the fingers adjusting their hold against Shadow's fur, the movement slow, deliberate, as though confirming the presence beneath them. Shadow did not move away. He did not react with excitement or restlessness. He simply remained, his body steady, his presence calm, offering nothing but continuity. The bond between them did not need explanation. It existed in the stillness, in the quiet understanding that had carried them through something unseen. Arthur's lips moved again, a faint attempt at forming sound, though nothing clear emerged. The effort was visible, the intention undeniable. Daniel did not press for more. He did not ask questions. He allowed the moment to remain what it was, a beginning, not a conclusion. Time passed in this quiet state, each second building upon the last, each small change reinforcing the return that was unfolding. The room remained calm, undisturbed, the outside world distant, its noise softened by walls that now held something far more important. Arthur's eyes opened a fraction more, the focus improving slightly, the search within them becoming less uncertain, more directed. His gaze moved once more to Shadow, lingering there, the connection instinctive, unspoken, yet deeply recognized. There was no confusion in that moment, only a quiet awareness that this presence mattered, that it had always mattered. Daniel watched this exchange without interruption, his expression steady, his understanding deepening in the silence. Some things did not need to be explained. They simply revealed themselves when the moment was right. Arthur's breathing remained steady, his body continuing its gradual return, each sign small, yet significant. The nurse stepped back again, allowing space, her role now one of observation rather than intervention. The room held its quiet shape, the lights soft, the air still, everything aligned with the pace of recovery that could not be rushed. Shadow lowered his head once more, settling gently against the bed, his eyes half-lidded, calm, watchful, his presence unwavering. He did not seek attention. He did not require acknowledgement. He simply remained, as he always had, close to the man who had needed him, even when no one else could see it. And as Arthur's gaze continued to steady, his awareness growing, his hand still resting against the dog's fur, it became clear that what had been nearly lost had not been reclaimed by chance alone. It had been held, quietly, patiently, by something that refused to accept silence as the end. The days that followed did not arrive with sudden change, but with a quiet consistency that settled into the rhythm of the room, each morning bringing a little more clarity, each evening carrying a little less uncertainty. Arthur's recovery did not rush forward. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, as though every part of him needed time to remember what it meant to be present in the world again. The light through the curtains grew warmer with each passing day, the gray of early rain giving way to softer tones, and with it, the atmosphere within the room shifted from fragile to steady. Daniel remained a constant presence, never imposing, never asking more than what Arthur could give, his quiet voice offering simple truths, grounding statements that asked nothing in return. Shadow never left the bedside. Not once. He moved only when necessary, stepping aside for the nurses, adjusting his position when Arthur was shifted, but always returning, always settling close enough that the connection between them remained unbroken. It became part of the routine, something the staff no longer questioned, something they began to accept as natural, as though the presence of the dog was not an exception, but an extension of the care itself. Arthur's awareness continued to sharpen, his gaze more focused now, his eyes no longer searching aimlessly but recognizing, holding on to faces, onto shapes, onto moments that anchored him more firmly with each passing hour. The confusion that had once clouded his expression began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. His voice returned gradually, at first no more than a faint whisper, the effort visible, the words slow to form, but present. Daniel did not rush him. He listened when Arthur spoke, even when the words were incomplete, even when they came with long pauses in between. The silence between them was never empty. It was filled with recognition, with shared understanding, with the kind of bond that did not rely on explanation. Shadow remained at the center of it all, not as a focus, not as something that demanded attention, but as a constant thread that tied everything together. Arthur's hand often rested in his fur, sometimes with intention, sometimes simply because it felt right, because it grounded him in a way nothing else could. There were moments when Arthur would wake in the early hours, the room dim, the world quiet, and his first movement would be to reach, not for the call button, not for reassurance from the room, but for the steady presence beside him. And each time, Shadow would be there, unmoving, as though he had never considered leaving. One afternoon, as the light filtered softly through the window, Arthur's voice found more strength, the words clearer, though still measured, still careful. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, his gaze steady now, his awareness no longer uncertain. "You listened," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Daniel held his gaze, the faintest hint of something softer crossing his expression. "No," he replied, his voice calm, grounded. He did. His eyes shifted briefly to Shadow, who remained still, his posture relaxed, his presence unchanged. Arthur followed the movement, his gaze settling on the dog, lingering there with quiet understanding. There was no surprise in his expression, no confusion, only recognition, as though somewhere beneath the silence he had passed through, he had always known. Arthur's hand moved slightly, his fingers resting more firmly against Shadow's fur, the connection deliberate now, not uncertain. "I remember," he said softly, the words slow but clear. Daniel did not ask what he remembered. He did not need to. The meaning was already there, carried in the stillness, in the way Arthur's gaze remained steady, in the quiet certainty that had replaced the earlier confusion. Time continued to move forward, not rushing, not forcing, but allowing each moment to settle fully before the next began. The doctors spoke of progress, of recovery, of time frames and expectations, but within the room, those things felt secondary. What mattered was already present. The steady breath, the clear gaze, the quiet connection that had never broken, even when everything else had seemed to. On the day Arthur was first able to sit up, the movement slow, supported, Shadow remained close, his head lifting slightly, his eyes attentive, as though observing not just the action, but the meaning behind it. Arthur paused once he was upright, his breath steady, his gaze moving around the room before returning, as it always did, to the dog beside him. He reached out, his hand more certain now, more controlled, resting against Shadow's neck with quiet assurance. There was no need for words in that moment. None were offered, none were required. Daniel stood nearby, his presence unchanged, his understanding complete. He watched the exchange without interruption, recognizing something that did not need to be spoken aloud. The bond between them had not been tested. It had been revealed. And in that quiet room, with the lights soft and steady, with the air calm and undisturbed, it became clear that what had happened was not something that could be measured or explained in simple terms. It had not been a matter of chance. It had not been a moment of confusion. It had been something far quieter, far more certain. A refusal to accept an ending that did not feel complete. Shadow lowered himself gently once more beside the bed, his head resting near Arthur's arm, his eyes calm, his presence unchanged. Arthur remained upright, his hand still resting against the dog's fur, his gaze steady, his breath even. Daniel watched them both for a moment longer, then allowed himself a slow, quiet exhale. Some stories do not end where they are expected to. They do not follow the lines drawn for them. They wait, they hold, and sometimes they begin again in the quietest way possible,